Deal is, we are now going to look at the New Deal on this slide. So the New Deal is basically just this term FDR uses for all these programs that he wants to fix America. And the first category he wants to fix is the banks, because the banks and the stock markets had collapsed. And if we don't get those to recover, the economy will not recover. And so we start with the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. This is the law that creates the FDIC. So the FDIC is a government agency that regulates banks and secures deposits. So it's still around today. If you put your money into a bank, I think up to $250,000, even if the bank goes out of business, the government, the FDIC specifically, will pay you back. So that's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So this is designed to restore faith in our banking system, and it worked. A lot of people will start putting their money back in banks. All right. Another thing we're going to pass is the Securities Act. Securities Act of 33 is going to create the SEC. That's the Securities and Exchanges Commission, which is going to regulate the stock market. It's going to ban a lot of different practices, like buying on margin, and forces companies to have to like overturn their records so that when you buy a stock, you actually know about the financial health of the company. You're not just gambling. And so long story short, Securities Act restores our faith a little bit in the stock markets. FDIC restores our faith in banks. And so with that, it kind of puts the financial sector back in a position where it can succeed. So now it's just going to take some time for people to put money back into them. Another thing you want to do is not just help the banks, but he also wanted to help people directly. But like Hoover, he feared the welfare state. He didn't just want to give people money. So instead, he created a bunch of what are called make-work programs, where he would give people jobs doing all sorts of things, some of them useful, some of them not so useful. But either way, if you wanted a paycheck from the government, you had to do stuff. And he creates a bunch of famous ones. The only ones we'll talk about, on the one hand, you got the PWA, that's the Public Works Administration. It's just this agency that builds public works, bridges, roads, stuff like that. More famous was the CCC. He loved the CCC. That was the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's going to hire a bunch of men between the ages of 18 and 25 to go out to rural areas and work. And they're going to build things like parks and roads and all sorts of things. And out of all their money, 80% of it would be paid to their parents and 20% would be paid to them. Now, why he did young men, he was trying to get them out of the workforce so they would not compete with older men. And why he put them out in rural areas, he didn't want them in urban areas where demagogues could prey upon them. So while all this is going on across the ocean, you have guys like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini preying upon young unemployed men in an effort to create political movements. He knew we were vulnerable to that too. So he was trying to get a lot of these young men out of the way so something like that wouldn't happen. And it worked. It was very popular. You see a picture there. If you've ever been to Hanging Rock State Park up in just north of Winston-Salem, that was built by the CCC. Or if you've ever driven on the Blue Ridge Parkway, that was begun under the CCC. And so again, they just go out to these rural areas and develop things. And they build many other parks. And he loved the program. He thought it was great. It was one of his favorites. Okay, another thing he's going to do as part of the first New Deal, he's going to help farmers, doing a lot of different things. On the one hand, you have the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically paid farmers to not grow things. So it's kind of like a farm subsidy. It's going to get ruled unconstitutional, but it was something designed to kind of help with overproduction, where we're just going to pay farmers to not grow stuff so that crop prices will recover on their own. Another program he did, a little more popular now, is going to be the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is going to go around the southeast, specifically around the Tennessee Valley River, the Tennessee River, and it's going to build dams. And these dams are going to provide hydroelectricity in these regions. It's going to stop flooding in this area, or at least limit flooding in this area. So it's basically just going to try to help one of the most depressed regions of our country. And still to this day, the TVA produces electricity for large numbers of people in this area. So it's an agency that's still around today. All right, another thing, he's going to do some major attempts at reform, where he's going to try to just change the very nature of the way the economy worked. One of those programs was FARA, Federal Emergency Relief Agency, and they literally were a welfare agency that just set up offices around America, and you could stop in once a month and pick up a check for $20. If you could show that you were unemployed. So basically, it's like an early form of like basic welfare. Or later in this era, we're going to see something called Aid for Families with Dependent Children, where people get a monthly check based on kids and their economic position. And so we see that as a major shift. Okay, another thing he's going to do, he's going to pass the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is going to create the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, different group. Okay. And what they're going to do, they're going to basically be this group that tries to change the way business works. It's going to do a number of things. First off, if you're a business that abides by the NRA policy, you get to hang this poster up in your storefront. Where basically what it does, it says, A, you agree to these voluntary codes of competition. B, you agree to honor collective bargaining, a minimum wage, maximum hours, a minimum work age, so it gets rid of child labor. And it will agree to like stable pricing. So basically, pro-business, you get to agree that you're going to do all these things in line with all your other competitors. Everybody's going to like regulate themselves. B, you get a higher price. But C, you're going to treat your workers better. And so when people would put these posters up, that was supposed to encourage customers to want to shop there because you knew you were at a company that was being regulated and you knew you were at a company that was treating their workers well. And the program was pretty popular when it started. In fact, the NFL, which was just expanding this era, National Football League, when they just created a new franchise in Philadelphia, they chose as their mascot the eagle, the Philadelphia Eagles, because of this poster and because of how popular this program was. But it only lasted for about 2 years. It was hard to manage. It didn't work very well. And so when the Supreme Court ordered it gone, FDR just let it die. So FDR's doing all this, but while he's doing it, he's receiving a ton of criticism. And so we're seeing this come from different areas. On the one hand, you have conservatives criticizing him. They don't like it, as you can see in this Plo cartoon, because they believe the New Deal is basically just a way to sneak tyranny into our government. And notice it's playing upon the Trojan horse. It's a Trojan donkey in this case, but whatever. Okay, so who were the conservatives that didn't like the New Deal for what it did in that regard? On the one hand, Republicans. Some Republicans were actually in favor of it, but a lot weren't. They just felt like it was too much government involvement in the economy. And a lot of them sat on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to rule a number of these agencies unconstitutional, as we talked about the APA already, we talked about the NRA, and there were several more, but you get the idea. Okay, and that's going to most famously show up in Schechter versus the U.S. 1935, called the Sick Chicken case, where in the Sick Chicken case of 1935, the Supreme Court ruled that the NRA just had too much power. It had the power of legislation, even though it was an executive agency. And so that needed to stop. And so the NRA was ruled unconstitutional in 35, and FDR was okay with that, but he also declared publicly that he felt like it was wrong. And so what he was going to do is fight them, and that's going to cause him some trouble down the road. Okay, and there's a picture from the New York Times showing all NRA enforcement. Get the idea. All right, another group that didn't really like it was Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats, if you remember, they have been Democrats for a long time, but they also tended to be conservative. So they don't like all this liberal stuff. So the way FDR appeased them was by funneling a lot of these programs and a lot of the money from the programs down into their districts. And by doing that, it kind of created this compromise with them, but a lot of them still weren't happy. And so that's going to be problematic down the road. Okay. Another group that was not happy with the New Deal were liberals, like a lot of them much more liberal than FDR was, whereas conservatives would say the New Deal is doing too much. A liberal would say, or somebody who's very liberal would say it's not doing enough. And so we're going to see that. One example of this is Charles Coughlin. He was a famous Catholic priest from this time period who had a radio show. He went around giving speeches, and he was kind of a demagogue. He just ruled with fear. He had millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of listeners every week. He was anti-Semitic. He actually supported Hitler at first because Hitler was the enemy of Jewish people, and Coughlin said he was too. He believed the New Deal was trying to protect Jewish people. Just a lot of just crazy views, but he had a lot of listeners, which shows us that a lot of Americans were saying that FDR is doing too much to protect the business community. He needs to do more to protect the American people, or whatever he was saying. But you get the idea. They're saying FDR needs to do more. Another guy said that, Dr. Francis Townsend, who comes up with Townsend clubs. His idea was that old people above the age of 60 should be given X amount of money. At one point, he said $2,000 a month, which would be a lot of money back then. Sometimes it was $200 a month. That'd still be a good chunk of money back then. But the 200 was his ultimate goal, where if we can just get old people to be given $200 to leave work so that they would not be at work, so younger people could get the jobs, and then the law would be passed that old people then had to spend every bit of it. Any cent that was left over at the end of the month, they'd be taxed at 100% rate. And so he's saying, FDR, do more, give more money to people directly. A lot of people believe his idea is what leads to Social Security. And then you have Huey Long, the most dangerous of them all, because Huey Long was more popular than the other two combined. And Huey Long was crazy. He was powerful. He was popular. He gave really good speeches. He was really charismatic. And he came up with this program called Share the Wealth, where every American would get a minimum net worth of $5,000. They get a minimum of $2,000 a year cash. Everybody would have a car, everybody would have a house, everybody would have a radio, and it would all be paid for by taxing the rich at 100%. So basically, it's like a form of communism almost, kind of. And he was really popular. He'd become a governor of Louisiana, then he was a senator, and it looked like he was gearing up for a presidential run in 1936 to challenge FDR. And FDR was terrified of him. FDR called him the second most dangerous man in America, behind only Douglas MacArthur, the general that will become famous in World War II and also was famous for attacking all those veterans in the Bonus Army March. But FDR obviously did not want him to rise up, was very concerned about him and the bleeding of votes that would happen to Huey Long from people that might otherwise support the New Deal. And so it looked like a problem, and then Huey Long was killed. His bodyguard shot him when somebody attacked him for sleeping with his wife. So Huey Long had a problem. A lot of people speculate that he got most of his plans for Every Man a King and Share the Wealth, the two names he used for his program, from a stripper named Blaze Starr that he used to spend time with. Just kind of a shady guy, but whatever. The key takeaway from these three guys is that they were radicals saying we want FDR to do more, help more people with more things. But then you also had criticism coming from John L. Lewis and the CIO. Not the same John Lewis who's a famous civil rights pioneer in Congress, but the John L. Lewis that has those eyebrows. Okay, he was very famous. He's a labor leader. He was with the AFL. But then he's going to split off the AFL in the 1930s to create the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And they're basically like a gigantic union for industrial unions, like the United Mine Workers, United Auto Workers, and other unions like that. And he's going to criticize FDR, saying, you talk a mean game about helping the workers, helping the common people, but you're not helping unions. And so he's going to push, we want more support for unions. And the CIO is going to become famous in this time period. With the sit-down strikes that they do in Flint, Michigan, and which causes General Motors to have to sign a collective bargaining agreement with them and whatever. So the CIO becomes this big, powerful union. And so you see a lot of labor activism during the Great Depression. And in the midst of this, we have midterm elections in 34. Now, a rule just always true almost in political history is the party in power during midterm elections almost always loses seats. Almost always. But in 34, that doesn't happen. As you can see on this chart, the blue lines are when Democrats are in power. The red lines are when Republicans are in power. And as you can see, what is happening? In every one of these things, it doesn't matter who's in power, the lines are always going negative. And it shows you the number of seats that are dropping. Okay? And so what ends up happening in 1934, that one single blip up there in to the pre-1980s period of the chart, that would be this one, where even though the Democrats had a huge majority in the Congress, by the end of the first 2 years of the New Deal, people elect even more Democrats to office. And that shows you how people were actually pretty happy by and large with the New Deal, and a lot of people wanted more. So these midterm elections and all the criticism that FDR takes for not doing enough is going to cause FDR to do even more. But as you can see, in the next midterm election, 1938, that's not going to go well for him. And for the rest of FDR's presidency, Democrats are going to start losing seats. So it's kind of hitting its peak here at this 34, 35, 36 period. So with the second New Deal, FDR pledges to take the first New Deal and do it even better. All right, so the second New Deal is just like the first, just even more. For example, he's going to do make-work programs, and we see the WPA. The WPA, just like all the others, he's hiring people to do jobs, but it spent more money hiring people than every other make-work program he ever created combined times 2. So this was a massive, 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 massive program that made all sorts of schools, stadiums, roads, parks, you name it, bridges. The WPA built it. All right, another thing, he's going to try to attack the housing problem because so many people were struggling to stay in houses or find apartments to live in. And the one thing he's going to do as part of the second New Deal, he's going to pass the Federal Housing Act, which creates the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. And their job is to help secure loans for people that struggle to get loans from a bank to buy a house. They're still around today. They still do the same thing. Another thing that's going to happen in 1937, he's going to pass the United States Housing Act, which creates the United States Housing Authority. And what that is, it's an agency that will give loans to local governments and state governments to build income for low housing community, or to build housing for low income communities, excuse me. Okay, so what is that? That's basically like the beginning of what you might call subsidized housing today, where people are going to get, subsidized housing. And sometimes people would refer to communities like that as the projects, which isn't always the nicest term for it. But that's basically what they're talking about, what this program was created to create. All right, another thing, they're going to help farmers even more. There's going to be a second AAA. There's going to be a Rural Electrification Act. There's going to be a Soil and Domestic Conservation Act. Long story short, it just keeps finding ways to either provide electricity for farmers, kind of like the TVA did, or to pay farmers to not grow things, to create this artificial scarcity that will raise crop prices. And by doing that, it's going to help farmers, just make more money. And so he's doing even more. Now, these weren't ruled unconstitutional in this part of it, partly because he changed its purpose. He said it wasn't to create artificial scarcity. It was to protect the environment and promote conservation. And by saying that, it then made it constitutional, even though ultimately its goal was to promote artificial scarcity, which raises prices. Then he's going to start helping labor. So this might be a direct byproduct of, on the one hand, the NIRA being ruled unconstitutional, and on the other hand, guys like John Lewis saying, FDR, you need to do more. And we see this sign that the CIO put forth. This was an actual quote from FDR. If I went to work in a factory, first thing I would do would be to join a union. And so it's basically FDR like coming down hard in support of unions, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt was kind of support of unions, Taft kind of, Wilson kind of. The Republicans of the 20s, not at all. FDR is full in supporting unions. And we're going to see how he's going to take pieces of the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and implement them into two separate laws. On the one hand, you have the Wagner Act, probably the most famous of these. It was the National Labor Relations Act that does two things. One, it legalizes collective bargaining all across the country, so employers have to deal with unions. And two, it also created the National Labor Relations Board that will oversee labor disputes. And obviously, these are things unions have been wanting for decades. Now they're getting it. So this is considered kind of like the peak of union support by our government. And it's going to last about 12 years. All right, the other thing that's going to happen, this was also part of the NIRA that got ruled unconstitutional, is the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this will be constitutional, much like the Wagner Act. Fair Labor Standards Act says minimum work age is 16, maximum work hours is 44, and minimum wage is 25 cents an hour. So it's creating minimum wage, maximum hours, and minimum work age, and we still have this law in effect today with, minimum wage is obviously higher, maximum hours 40, and, the work age, has different levels based on the year. But long story short, these are things that labor wanted, and so you end up with, pictures like this, that got rid of child labor, want the 40-hour work week, et cetera, et cetera. And now we get to possibly the most important law of all of the ones he passed, the Social Security Act. And this law was big. This is the single biggest change in American government philosophy towards the economy, where the Social Security Act is going to create a program where people pay payroll taxes and your employer pays payroll taxes to a government Social Security trust fund. Trust fund then holds the money and then creates programs to help the elderly, the people, beyond the age of 65, survivors. So like if a husband dies, the widow and the children will get a pension. The disabled. So if you ever hear about disability, that's frequently covered out of the Social Security Trust Fund. And other programs like that just, long story short, temporary unemployment compensation comes out of that, whatever. But this becomes a big program. This is a program that directly puts the federal government into the midst of the U.S. economy, right? And you see posters like this, a monthly check to you for the rest of your life beginning when you're 65. And so go get your Social Security number promptly and all that stuff. You see that, when you're elderly, you'll get this so you don't have to work anymore. Or if you're the survivor, the widow will receive monthly benefits. Okay. So long story short, Social Security changes everything, and still a program around today, we hope, for a while, but we'll see. But yeah, so FDR's doing a lot more. So the second New Deal is similar to the first New Deal, but even more help for more people. So addressing the issue of housing, addressing the issue of labor, more help for farmers, and then Social Security, and even more of these make work programs. So the Second New Deal shows us the New Deal operating at its peak. And with that, we now take a little just look at what's going on socially during the Depression. And there's just a lot going on with different people groups in the Depression. We start with women. Women had about 50% unemployment rate in the Great Depression, higher than the rest of the population, in large part because it was viewed in society. A lot of people in society said that a woman should not work in the Great Depression, that if there's a scarce number of jobs in society, then a woman should stay home and take care of the kids while the men go and work, which is obviously on the one hand, quite sexist. On the other hand, it showed how society still largely believed in the cult of domesticity, which was what it was just a big part of American history in this time period. But it also then means who's in trouble. Well, women who aren't married, or women who are married but their husband can't get a job. So long story short, women are going to suffer. A lot of women end up just moving into like flop houses and these other places. That was just a nickname for like a homeless shelter in this time period, where a lot of them are so ashamed of being in this position that they literally just kind of vanish, and people never see them again. Some of them just starve to death in these places. They never literally tell anybody they have need and stuff like that. A lot of women who are mothers will just give up on eating so that they can like conserve food for their children. And you'll actually see a lot of children in society run away, sometimes driven by the fact that they want to run away so that their mom will start eating again. But yeah, so just lots of changes going on with family structure. Divorce rates go way down in large part because if you're a woman and you're married to somebody and they have a job, like even if the marriage is terrible, just a lot of women feel compelled to stay in that marriage. Childbirth rate goes down because a lot of women are not willing to have children in the Great Depression just because you don't know if you'll be able to feed the kids or take care of them. So just a lot of things that directly impact family structure and women explicitly. But having said that, there were some positives going on where we see Frances Perkins. She will be the first Secretary of Labor, the first cabinet member that is a woman. There's a picture of her behind FDR while FDR is signing the Wagner Act, I believe that was. Now, Frances Perkins was one of the key members of his cabinet. It wasn't just that, you have the token female member of the cabinet, but also she was very good. She's one of the most competent cabinet members that's ever been in our federal government. She's probably the brains behind the Wagner Act, most people agree. She's the brains behind the Social Security Act and getting it through Congress. So just a terribly competent person. And so obviously with her being the first woman to be in the cabinet and her being very good at her job, that's going to open doors to more involvement in the government. So she goes down in history being a very important person. And then you have Eleanor Roosevelt, who goes down in history as being the first really, really important first lady we've ever had. Now, on the one hand, you'd probably expect me to say she's going to be like a pioneer for women's rights. That's not directly the case, where I don't think she opposed women's rights by any stretch, but she's actually more of a pioneer for civil rights. That's where she really wanted to have her focus. And after Eleanor Roosevelt, a lot of first ladies, much like Eleanor, are going to say, hey, I need to have like a focus too. I need to have like a crusade. Melania's has been cyberbullying. Michelle Obama's was healthier eating. Just Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, just say no to drugs. Just everybody's got their thing. But Eleanor's was civil rights. And so she's going to be a key figure in reaching out to the Black community, working with key members of the Black community, and being like a link between FDR and the Black community, which FDR struggled with. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. All right, so what's going on in the Black community and just some of the changes going on? Well, on the one hand, you're going to see that there were several gains during this time period for the Black community. These will be counterbalanced with a lot of losses, but we'll start by talking about the positives. Basically, African Americans were able to participate in large numbers of the New Deal agencies, so that was a positive. So like a lot of these economic benefits that existed for Americans, the Black community was able to participate in as well. And like I said on the last slide, there's going to be examples of FDR reaching out to the Black community through his wife Eleanor in order to gain more input into the New Deal. Famous examples of that would be her. That is Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an early civil rights pioneer. And she's obviously a Black woman, and she's going to be the leader of the NYA. That's the National Youth Administration, which was one of the single largest New Deal agencies. I believe it was under the WPA, if I remember correctly, because the WPA just oversaw a lot of different groups. So the fact that an African-American woman is leading a group this significant and this large was obviously a very important step for our federal government in its history of not allowing any participation of the Black community in the processes of government. Another example of this is going to be the Black Cabinet. The Black Cabinet was a nickname of the leaders from the Black community that Eleanor would go meet with from time to time. And there's a photograph. That's not every member of the Black Cabinet, but you see like a lot of African American community leaders are going to meet, participate, come up with ideas, and then present them to Eleanor just to kind of be like, these are ideas. What does the Black community need? And so basically the Black community has a voice in the federal administration, and that is a significant change from what we've seen before. And so that's considered a very important step. Again, by no means are we seeing equality in this time period, but these are steps towards something better. Okay. What are some of the limitations? Well, one, a lot of these New Deal agencies were segregated. A lot of them were limiting. Many of them did not allow African Americans to participate at all. So, the positives is some did. The negatives is that a lot didn't. And sadly, that's just how America was at this time period. We had a long way to grow as it came to this issue. Another thing would be like a lot of the AAA programs and stuff like that were a problem because they ended up not allowing African Americans to make money in farms. Because what happened a lot with these, you pay farmers to not grow things, they would just go out to their sharecroppers and say, well, you guys are the guys not growing things. And with that, we see major setbacks economically for the Black community under those types of programs. So on the one hand, you have gains and that African Americans have any participation in the programs at all, but on the other hand, you have setbacks and that wasn't an exclusive right. That was something that was only offered at times. What is the response of the Black community? Well, you're going to see some varying responses. On the one hand, NAACP membership declines dramatically, which in large part is probably because people are just broke, because the Black community had a 50% unemployment rate similar to what we saw with women. And so with that much unemployment, whereas with women, that was driven by like this cult of domesticity, your husband should have the job type mindset, which in no way is right, but it's what society believed back then. There's no argument for this other than just racism. Society frequently laid off Black workers first just because of basically discrimination and racism that still floated around society widely in this time period. So W. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP and one of the leaders of the Black community in this time period, had been for a couple decades. This is the point where he basically gives up on America and he says, I'm out. I don't want to participate in this society anymore. I'm tired of fighting for this society. And he's actually going to soon after this move to Ghana in Africa and just spend most of the rest of his life there. And just he becomes very cynical, very jaded, and very opposed to a lot of even the attempts at reform that are going on. Not that he opposes the reform itself, but just cynical in his belief that they'll actually succeed. Another example of the response is going to show up in the rise of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is going to become the founder of a group called the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam is basically going to pick up where Marcus Garvey left off. Where on the one hand, you have the Pan-African message, kind of Black pride, Black empowerment that we saw with Marcus Garvey, but he's going to pair it with the teachings of Islam. So you have like the moral codes and the moral purities and the 5 pillars and that. So basically the Nation of Islam becomes like this voice of African American empowerment while also promoting like a empowered segregation from the white community, like we saw with Marcus Garvey. And so this is going to pick up that voice. And out of this Nation of Islam that's going to rise up in the 1930s are going to come leaders like Malcolm X or Louis Farrakhan, who later will become important voices in advocacy for rights and just the different conflict we're going to see, especially in disagreements between like Martin Luther King down the road and Malcolm X. But this carries that mantle of Marcus Garvey into the next generation, and they're still around today. Okay. And then maybe the most famous event that happened in the 1930s that showed just possibly some development in the role that African Americans are going to be able to experience in our society, at least as it pertains to how people are viewed by the courts, is going to be the trial of the Scottsboro Boys. Okay, the Scottsboro Boys were from Alabama. There's a picture of them. You see 9 in the back. Okay, well, 8 in the back and then 1 sitting in the front. Okay, they were arrested for rape. And all 9 of them in a trial were sentenced to death. Okay, what ends up happening, though, is a lawyer heard about it. You can see the lawyer in the front. He's a guy sitting there writing something down with his pencil. Okay, and he felt like they didn't get a fair trial because the jury was all white. And the lawyer didn't even agree to represent them. So he reaches out to them and he says, hey, can I appeal this case for you? They say yes. He appeals it. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court initially throws out the ruling and remands it down back to the lower court, saying that because your attorney did not represent you, because their first attorney literally said he had no defense, that this guy representing them now could try it again. And so they tried it again with an actual attorney defending them. And once again, they were found guilty, sentenced to death. So he appeals it again, saying, well, it's because the jury was all white and all male. So it gets remanded back down to the lower courts again. And in this time, it's going to be a jury that was several members were black, several members were white, and they redo it again. And with this new jury, a couple of them were found guilty. I think 5 of them were found innocent, and 2 of them were found guilty of a lesser crime. And so basically, you're going to see, I think, a 20-year prison sentence on one guy, 15 on another, 5, maybe a 1, and then 4 guys don't get sentenced to any punishment at all, or whatever the ratio was. I got the details a little bit mixed up in my head there. But the point is, this is showing development. On the one hand, you have 9 guys that almost certainly are not guilty of a crime. Based on the evidence we know about the case, it's not likely this was actually rape. At least a lot of historians say that. There are a few who say maybe. I mean, just historians always differ on these issues a little bit, depending who's writing. So on the one hand, you have men getting punished for a crime that they might not have actually committed. So that's a problem, obviously. But on the other hand, you have a society that typically wouldn't have given these guys even the semblance of a fair trial and would have just said, all 9 of you die. And 4 of them aren't going to get punished, and 5 of them are getting punishments that are seemingly, well, obviously better than the death penalty. So a lot of people would tell you, whereas this trial is very unfair, on the other hand, it also might be a step towards something that shows fairer is on the horizon. And that's definitely going to be something that we see in the 30s, whereas the black community generally suffering during the 30s just because of the mass amounts of unemployment and poverty. There are these little symbols that are popping up that show things are about to get better, and they were. And so we'll continue to learn that as we move forward into the future. And with that, you just see the protesters kind of demanding justice. And then the last slide we're going to see for just some social changes going on during the Depression is the role of Native Americans, who we haven't talked much about since the Gilded Age, because when we left the Native American community in the Gilded Age, basically a lot of the Native Americans were either A, still living on reservations, or B, they'd been assimilated into our society under the Dawes Act. And so just things hadn't really changed in a couple decades. But then in the 1930s, things are going to improve somewhat. With the rise of John Collier. John Collier is the man pictured in there that's not in traditional Native American wardrobe. Okay, he's wearing the suit. Okay, John Collier was an advocate for the Native American communities. He'd studied what had happened in the Native American communities. He'd reached out to Native American communities, and he felt like something needed to be different. So he comes up with what he calls the quote-unquote Indian New Deal, which he will then encompass in his Indian Reorganization Act. And what this did, it basically just rebranded a lot of our federal government policies, because he was the head of our Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was called. And so under the Indian Reorganization Act, to make a very long story short, it's going to reverse the Dawes Act. It's going to tell all Native American tribes, like, if you want to live on your reservations and you want to have autonomy on your reservations, we will give you more of that back than you had under the Dawes Act. So a lot of things are going to happen where Native Americans are going to benefit under this. Obviously, it doesn't make up in any way whatsoever for all the different negative things we've learned over the centuries. But for the first time in a long time ever, unless you count John Quincy Adams' Treaty of Washington in 1827, our federal government is actually doing something that somewhat benefits the Native American community and advocates something that they had been advocating themselves. Okay. Another thing we're going to see is how there's a lot of changes with Latin American migration, which really started around the turn of the century. It started with a lot of Cuban and Puerto Rican migrants, with a lot of the Puerto Ricans after the Spanish-American War, where we take over Puerto Rico, moving up the East Coast to New York, where we see kind of a thriving Puerto Rican community there. And then, like in Florida, we see a large Cuban population develop as a result of our interaction with Cuba during the war. And so we see how that was kind of like the birth of Latin American migration in the United States, but it's really going to start developing in the 20th century with Mexican migration in the United States. We see 1902, we had the Newlands Reclamation Act, which irrigated a lot of the southwestern fields that were dry. And by doing that, that's going to allow a lot of, or create the need for a lot of farm labor. And so a lot of Mexican people will come up to work on the farms of the Southwest, like California, Arizona, Texas, whatnot. And so we see that. Then during the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa, we learn about the last unit. Okay, that's going to displace a lot of refugees who are going to come up and start working on these farms and just looking for opportunities to get away from the war that was rampaging through their country. And then in the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, when things were pretty good in our society, the economy is pretty good, we're going to see another surge in Mexican migration to work on the farms, because these were jobs that we just weren't particularly keen on doing ourselves. And so a lot of migrants from Mexico come up, as you can see in this picture. This is a picture of a Mexican migrant family living in the 1920s in the United States. And obviously not good conditions by any stretch, but just an example of some of these families. But then we get this thing where in the 1930s, the economy collapses, and now more people are willing to work these jobs that they weren't. More native-born Americans of Anglo-Saxon background are willing to work these jobs. And so there's a push in society to push Mexican migrants out of our country, which in the 1930s, our government responds to and begins deporting large numbers of Mexican migrants. And so a lot of people are going to be pushed out of our country. And we're going to see as we move through the 20th century, we just go through these periods of what I would call almost like a yo-yo type movement, where the 20s, it's welcome them in, the 30s, it's push them out, the 40s are going to be welcome them in, the 50s are going to be push them out, the 60s welcome them in. And obviously, you don't need to look too far into current events to see how these contradictory policies to bring them in, send them out, bring them in, send them out are going to continue into our future. But this is the era where we really start to see that, but we also start to see population of Latin American descent rise up in our country, and Hispanic culture becomes part of our culture, as we already looked at a little bit with some of the artwork changes that are going on, and we're going to see a little more of as we move into the future. And so again, you just see a protester of somebody who's saying, hey, you need to stop these illegal raids, stop deporting people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so by the end of the 30s, the New Deal is about to decline, and it all starts with the election of 1936. The election in 1936 is FDR's best, where he runs again, overwhelmingly supported by his own party, by a lot of moderates, and Republicans run a guy who named Alf Landon, a governor of Kansas, who basically said, I'll do the New Deal, I'll just do it better than FDR did, and people aren't buying it. FDR just trounces him. FDR was really popular, New Deal was really popular. And this map is obvious. Now, this map's also going to be a problem because FDR interprets this map as a mandate to basically do whatever he wants, and that's going to get him into trouble. So on the first thing he's going to do, he's going to scale back the New Deal. He's going to cut some of the programs where he says, I'm so confident my New Deal has fixed the economy, I'm going to get rid of some of the programs, and you're going to see that the economy, with its pump-primed Keynesian theory, it doesn't need the government's help. Well, when he scales them back, unemployment spikes. And when unemployment spikes, he has to put them back in. So for the first time, FDR looks human. The second thing he does that's going to get him into trouble is he's going to try to pack the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had been a contradictory force against his New Deal, ruling several of his programs unconstitutional. And now that he has this map behind him, he's saying, hey, why does the Supreme Court get to deny me if the entire rest of the country obviously supports me? And so he threatens to put 6 new judges into the court, saying that we need to prepare for all these older Republican judges to retire. But by putting 6 new judges in, he will then outnumber the Republican judges, and so he'll basically make the court into what he wants it. Okay, and so you see political cartoons like this, where FDR is punching right through the Constitution and crushing the court. But it looked like FDR is going to do it anyway, until he gets a bunch of criticism, and then one of the judges retires, or 2 of the judges retired, just to avoid all this scandal, and another one who used to vote conservative starts voting liberal, and with that, the court kind of swings on its own volition, and so FDR then backs off court packing, but it did make him a little bit unpopular with people who said he was acting like a tyrant. But maybe the most important thing he did that makes him lose support of the people is when in 1937, okay, you have the Nazis have already taken over Germany, and they marched into the Rhineland, so it looks like Adolf Hitler and his Nazi war machine is growing. You've got Benito Mussolini has invaded North Africa and the Italians. You've got the Japanese who've now invaded China for the second time and are committing just horrible atrocities on the Chinese people. It appears a war is imminent somewhere in the world as a bunch of totalitarian dictators are rising up. And so FDR, with that map behind him, thinks, well, I speak for the people. And FDR recognized this war is going to find us whether we like it or not. So the question is, we can either jump into it early and stop it from getting bad, or we can avoid it. So he decides to make a speech in Chicago that gets called the quarantine speech, where he basically said totalitarianism is on the rise, and all democratic nations of the world need to rise up against it. We need to quarantine this, because if these countries keep spreading totalitarian ideals, the whole world will fall. And a lot of people interpret that as him trying to push us into this developing what we're obviously later going to call World War II. And Americans weren't hearing it. Americans were still very isolationist. They wanted nothing to do with this. And they didn't like that FDR was trying to push us that way. A group's going to rise up called the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, just some of the famous names that support it. And so what they're going to do, they're going to just start to raise awareness about FDR's a monster. He's trying to get us into this war, oppose him, oppose the war. And so this speech backfires. He thought he was popular enough. He could kind of steer us that direction. He was wrong. And in the midterm elections of 38, Democrats get trounced. And so what ends up happening, that with Democrats getting trounced, they still hold the majority in the Congress. But between Republicans and Southern Democrats, who, if you remember, were kind of somewhat conservative, they don't want to hear any more of his New Deal message. So we're going to quit seeing the New Deal at that point. So the New Deal is basically over. And what is the legacy of the New Deal? Well, one, FDR definitely got people to believe the government plays a role in the economy. And whether it should, whether it shouldn't, conservatives and liberals can debate, and that's up to them to debate. But a lot of people still expect it, and that is a byproduct of the New Deal. Another one, a bunch of agencies are still around today. The TVA, the FDIC, the SEC, Social Security, and many others are still around today because of the New Deal, and they continue to play an important role in our society. Another legacy of the New Deal is it's going to cause a lot of political realignment in America, where what we're going to see is we're going to see the traditional Democratic balance. And if you remember, the Democrats used to be the party of the Solid South, and then they were the party of a lot of immigrants, and that was their two solid bases of support. And then other than that, they just tried to reach out to moderates and stuff by running people like Grover Cleveland, or reach out to farmers by running people like William Jennings Bryan. But now in the New Deal era, we're going to see the rise of what's called the New Deal Coalition. And the New Deal Coalition is basically the coalition of voters that are going to be paired with the immigrants in the Solid South in order to create this new Democratic Party base. And obviously a powerful one if you're looking back at that election of 1936 map, where one of the groups are women, where women start to lean Democrat in this period. In large part, probably because the New Deal is just helping people in general. And so women, like all people, are appreciating that and starting to lean that way. Some people think it's because someone were inspired by Eleanor Roosevelt or Francis Perkins. But either way, women start to lean the direction of Democrats. Another group, African Americans, whereas the Democrats were still not advocating for civil rights openly, the fact that they did reach out to the black community through the black cabinet or appointing people like Mary McLeod Bethune, or the fact the New Deal did, in fact, help many African Americans economically, we start to see how African Americans, who used to be a voting group that tended to lean Republican, now are going to start to strongly lean Democrat. Skip ahead another decade, when Democrats start to openly support civil rights, that's going to finalize that. Okay, another one is labor, right? Where labor had kind of been this party or group that went both ways. But in this period, with the support of the Wagner Act, with the support of Social Security, with the support of the Fair Labor Standards Act, labor and other working class Americans are going to strongly support the Democrats. And labor unions are going to become one of the big mobilizing units for the Democratic Party. Another one is just the poor people and the working class in general, in large part because of all the different ways the New Deal protected those people and tried to create programs for them. Okay, another group is going to be farmers because of all the different programs that he did, whether it's the AAA or the TVA or the Rural Electrification Act, Soil Domestic Conservation Allotment Act, the second AAA, just all these programs that help farmers. They're going to become the Farmers Party for a while. Then you get Native Americans. Again, there are very few Native Americans left in our society relative to their population, but they start to become strong Democratic voters, in large part because of the Indian Reorganization Act and the work of John Collier. Okay, and then you get conservationists, because conservationists, if you remember, were a voting group, relatively small, but they support environmental conservation and whatnot. And a lot of them kind of went both ways, because on the one hand, you had Woodrow Wilson creating the National Park Service, but on the other hand, you had Teddy Roosevelt being the most famous conservationist in our country's history and making national parks and the Bureau of Forestry and all that stuff. But in this period, the Democrats are going to do a lot of those New Deal programs are going to accomplish conservation by creating parks, creating irrigation, just all these different things conservationists wanted. And so by FDR doing it, that's going to make conservation as kind of a strong Democratic voting bloc. But the important question is, what did the New Deal not do? And as we see on this chart, it did not solve the Great Depression, right? The Great Depression at the peak had roughly a 25% unemployment rate. You can see that towards the end of Hoover's presidency on this chart. And the New Deal definitely made gains. You see a lot of people benefited under the New Deal as unemployment did go down. You do see that little spike in unemployment. That's where FDR tried to scale it back on the previous slide. But at the end of the day, what makes unemployment kind of vanish as a problem and kind of puts our society back on fully the right track economically, or at least mostly the right track economically? It's going to be World War II. World War II, just the full mobilization and full employment that we get while preparing for World War II. That's what's going to effectively end the Depression. Ultimately, the New Deal helped a lot with the Depression. It certainly helped people a lot mentally and emotionally, just knowing the government was fighting for them and trying to do things. But it did not end it, and unemployment remained high throughout the bulk of the New Deal. So that's the end of the 1930s, except for foreign policy, but we're going to cover that as part of World War II and the 40s, and I will post that PowerPoint next week sometime.